Welcome to Baha'i On Air. We're doing another deep dive into the Baha'i writings.
I'm Mark.
And I'm Jane.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a really significant piece of writing about the future, really. It's a letter from October 1985, sent out by the Universal House of Justice, addressed to the peoples of the world. And the title is The Promise of World Peace.
That's right. And you shared this with us. And, well, it's definitely not just some historical document collecting dust.
No, not at all.
It's a really deep analysis of where humanity stood then. And it offers this, clear vision for achieving peace, grounded in Baha'i principles.
So our plan today is to sort of unpack its main arguments, right? Understand what they were trying to say back then, and importantly, why it still matters today.
Exactly. How these ideas resonate now.
Okay, so let's dive in. Reading that opening, wow, it states that the great peace is now at long last within the reach of the nations. That feels like a huge claim, especially for 1985. What's the core message there?
Well, what's striking is the confidence, isn't it? The first big takeaway is that peace isn't just like a nice dream.
Right.
The letter actually says it's inevitable.
Inevitable.
Yeah. It calls it the next stage in the evolution of this planet. There's even a quote about the planetization of mankind, like, for the first time, we can see the world as one single unit.
But it doesn't just leave it there. It immediately gives us this stark choice. It says peace can come through, quote, unimaginable horrors if we cling to old patterns, or we can embrace it now through an act of consultative will. So, inevitable, yet a choice. Yeah. How does that work? It puts the responsibility on all who inhabit the earth?
Yeah, that's a really important question, and the letter kind of tackles it head on. How can it be both?
Right.
The source seems to suggest inevitability in the grand sweep of history. Humanity will get there eventually because that's the way evolution is heading.
Okay.
But the agency, the choice, is in how we get there. Is it going to be through terrible suffering because we're stubborn, or can we choose a better way, the consultative path?
And not choosing that better path
is called unconscionably irresponsible. Especially, it says, because global problems had become so tangled up, like one common concern, we couldn't ignore the interconnectedness anymore.
Okay, so it lays out this huge possibility, this choice. Then it looks at the world in 85. It actually points to some hopeful signs back then.
Yeah.
What were those positive trends?
Yeah, it does highlight some promising things. It talks about steps towards world order, like the move from the League of Nations to the UN. And critically, it mentions all the nations gaining independence after World War II. It saw that as the completion of the process of nation building.
Right. Major shift.
Huge. And these nations, new and old, were doing more internationally, cooperating in science, education, law, economics.
Okay.
And it mentions the rise of international aid groups, women's and youth movements pushing against war, and even just ordinary people connecting across borders, widening networks, seeking understanding.
It also talks about science and technology, how they portend a great surge forward, and even provide the means for the administration of a united world. But then come the barriers, despite all that potential.
Yes, it's very realistic about the hurdles. It lists things like doubts, misconceptions, prejudices, suspicions, and narrow self-interest. Still sound familiar, right?
Unfortunately, yes. So this is where the letter kind of shifts perspective, doesn't it? It brings in the Baha'i teachings specifically.
It does. The writers say they feel this deep sense of spiritual and moral duty to share insights from Baha'u'lláh given over a century earlier. They see themselves as trustees of those teachings.
And Baha'u'llah's words, quoted there, they paint a picture from the 19th century that feels, well, incredibly relevant now.
It's quite striking. He's quoted saying, "The winds of despair are, alas, blowing from every direction. The strife that divides and afflicts the human race is daily increasing, and that the prevailing order appears to be lamentably defective."
And the letter flatly states this prophetic judgment was amply confirmed by experience. It mentions the UN's failure to stop war, economic threats, anarchy, terrorism, widespread suffering.
Yeah.
But here's a really key point, I think. It notes how aggression and conflict seems so baked into our systems,
Yes.
leading people to think maybe that's just human nature, that it's intrinsic and therefore ineradicable.
And that belief, the letter argues, creates this paralyzing contradiction. We want peace, but we accept this idea that humans are just, incorrigibly selfish and aggressive.
Exactly. And that contradiction stops us from really acting.
Right.
So the letter says, wait a minute, we need to re-examine this assumption about human nature. It claims the evidence shows that aggression isn't our true self, but a distortion of the human spirit.
That's a crucial insight, isn't it? It's not that we're fundamentally bad in a way that makes peace impossible. The bad behavior is a distortion.
Yeah.
And if we recognize that, the letter suggests, then the constructive forces, the ones that are part of our true nature, can actually foster cooperation.
So it's not denying the problems, but reframing how we understand them.
Precisely. Seeing the current world confusion, as it calls it, not as the end, but as a natural phase in this huge organic process towards unification.
Like growing pains.
Yeah.
It uses that analogy of humanity as an individual, currently in a turbulent adolescence approaching its long-awaited coming of age.
Right. And seeing it that way as a collective coming of age shouldn't make us despair. The letter says it's actually a prerequisite for building peace. The confidence is amazing. It says, look, this is possible. The forces exist. The structures can be built.
Even future suffering doesn't have to mean the end of civilization. It could actually release the potentialities inherent in the station of man. A very different perspective.
A fundamentally hopeful one, despite acknowledging the difficulties.
Okay, so building on that foundation, the letter then digs into the root causes of conflict. It starts with the human spirit and the role of religion. It defines the spirit with the mind as its essential quality, as what makes us human, enables civilization. But then it adds.
Yeah, it adds that key point. Such accomplishments alone have never satisfied the human spirit.
Why not?
Because, the letter argues, the spirit naturally leans towards transcendence, towards the ultimate reality, called God. There's an innate spiritual longing.
And religion is positioned as the primary link to that reality, the thing that galvanizes and refines our ability to achieve both spiritual and social progress together.
That's the core insight here. You can't really try to fix the world, achieve peace, if you just ignore religion. It quotes someone calling religion a basic faculty of human nature.
But it acknowledges the problems religion has caused, too.
Oh, absolutely. It's clear that the perversion of religion has led to terrible conflict and confusion, but it still stresses religion's massive historical influence on civilization, laws, morality.
And it includes that powerful quote from Baha'u'lláh about religion as a force for order.
Yes. Religion is the greatest of all means for the establishment of order and for the peaceful contentment of all. But the flip side is just as strong. If it's corrupted, then chaos and confusion will ensue, and things like fairness, justice, peace just cease to shine.
Wow. And it lists the consequences when religion goes wrong. Perversion of human nature, breakdown of institutions, loss of hope. Pretty devastating.
It is. So the argument is, if we're stuck in paralyzing conflict, we need to look at ourselves, our own negligence, and the misleading ideas we've accepted in the name of religion.
It puts a lot of responsibility on religious leaders and followers who've clung blindly and selfishly to their particular orthodoxies.
And imposed interpretations that clash. It also criticizes those artificial barriers people put up between faith and reason or science and religion.
So the insight is that if you actually look fairly at what the founders of the world's religions said.
Exactly. The letter claims you won't find support for all the prejudices that divide religious communities and mess up human affairs.
It uses the Golden Rule as an example of a shared core ethic, highlighting not just the peace aspect, but the unity aspect, which it says we've failed to appreciate.
And it laments that failure. If humanity had seen these founders as agents of one civilizing process, we could have benefited so much more from the combined effect of their teachings. The potential for unity was there all along.
What about religious fanaticism? The letter mentions a resurgence back in '85.
It describes it almost like a dying convulsion. The violence it causes, the letter argues, actually shows the spiritual bankruptcy behind it.
So fanaticism isn't a sign of religious strength.
Quite the opposite, according to this source. It actually undermines the very values the religion supposedly stands for. It's a sign of decay, not vitality.
The letter also talks about people who find religion totally irrelevant.
Right, and it suggests they often turn elsewhere for answers, either to just chasing material things, hedonistic pursuit, or to various man-made ideology.
And it's pretty critical of those ideologies.
Very critical. It argues many fail because they don't embrace the oneness of humanity. Instead, they might deify the state, or put one group above others, or suppress discussion, or just abandon millions to an unfair economic system.
It calls them substitute faiths. Strong words.
Yes, and it says their track record is tragic. Look at the massive disillusionment, the social and economic ills. Those are their fruits, the letter argues. And underneath, spiritual damage, apathy, loss of hope.
And it directly challenges the people pushing materialism, whether capitalist or socialist.
It does. It basically says, you claimed you had the answers. You were going to be the moral stewards. So where's the new world? Where's the peace? Why are people still suffering amidst so much wealth? Tough questions.
And it connects this materialism back to that core idea about human nature.
Yes, here's a key connection. The roots which nourish the falsehood that human beings are incorrigibly selfish and aggressive are found in glorifying material pursuits. That whole mindset, it says, must be cleared to build a better world.
So this section ends with a call for a fresh effort, because the materialistic answers haven't worked.
Right. It frames the problems as a common failure, needing a common remedial effort. And fundamentally, it says it's about attitude. Are we going to stick with outworn concepts, or are leaders going to consult together to find real solutions?
And that advice to leaders is really powerful. If old ideas, institutions, even religious formulas aren't working for human welfare anymore,
let them be swept away. Don't cling to them. Institutions exist for humanity, not humanity to be crucified for some doctrine.
that's a call for some serious reevaluation.
Fearless reevaluation, really, for the sake of peace.
Okay, so moving from diagnosis to prescription. The next part talks about what is needed for peace. And it starts by saying what won't work.
Right. It argues that just banning specific weapons, nuclear, chemical, biological, won't solve the fundamental problem. It calls those superficial measures.
Why superficial?
Because people are clever. They'll just invent other kinds of warfare. The letter even mentions weaponizing food, raw materials, finance, industrial power, ideology, and terrorism. The insight is you have to address the causes of war, not just the tools.
And just settling specific conflicts here and there isn't enough either.
No. The massive dislocation is too big for just patching things up. We need, it says, a genuine universal framework.
But the letter points out that leaders know the problems are global. Studies exist, solutions have been proposed, so what's stopping action?
It identifies this paralysis of will. That's the core issue that needs tackling.
A paralysis of will. Why?
Well, the letter argues it comes from the deep-down belief that humans are just inevitably quarrelsome, which makes leaders reluctant to give up any national self-interest or really face what a united world authority would mean.
Makes sense.
And it also mentions the problem of largely ignorant and subjugated masses unable to really push for change.
But it does see some hopeful signs, those tentative steps in international cooperation.
Yes, it points to efforts like the UN and regional groups like ASEAN, the European communities, the OAU. It sees these as steps preparing the path to world order.
And the UN itself, despite its flaws, gets some credit for focusing on deep-rooted problems.
Definitely. It highlights things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, conventions against genocide, discrimination, torture, hunger. The letter suggests these give people hope, and if they were actually courageously enforced and expanded, they could really diminish the power of war.
Then the letter lists specific issues it sees as, like, essential prerequisites for peace.
Yeah.
Quite a list.
It is. It goes through several critical areas. First, racism, calls it a most baneful and persistent evil, a major barrier. The solution, recognize human oneness, legally enforce it.
Crucial.
Then, the gap between rich and poor, a source of acute suffering, instability, almost like war itself, needs spiritual, moral, and practical approaches, real consultation involving everyone affected, and a new universal attitude based on spiritual understanding.
Okay.
Unbridled nationalism has to yield to a wider loyalty, loving humanity as a whole. And that famous Baha'i quote, "The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens." World citizenship isn't just an ideal, it's a practical result of our interconnected world. Love your country, sure, but prioritize the whole.
Important distinction.
Religious strife, a historical blight, totally abhorrent now. Leaders must face their differences, show mutual forbearance, and work together for peace. Equality of women and men, called one of the most important prerequisites, even if less acknowledged. Denying equality is unjust and breeds harmful attitudes that spill over into international relations. Full partnership is needed for the right moral and psychological climate.
That's a really strong point.
Universal education needs utmost support. Ignorance fuels prejudice and decline. Educate everyone, prioritize women and girls for faster progress, and teach world citizenship everywhere.
Makes sense.
And finally, lack of communication undermines peace. Getting an international auxiliary language needs most urgent attention.
Wow. That covers a lot of ground. And after listing all those, it makes two key points about the overall effort.
Yes. First, it repeats that ending war is complex. It needs commitment to issues we don't normally link to peace. Political deals alone aren't enough. Collective security based just on agreements, a chimera, an illusion.
Okay, and the second point.
This is maybe the most profound. The main challenge is to lift the whole discussion to the level of principle beyond just pragmatism.
Principle, not just pragmatism. So peace isn't just about rules, it's about an inner state.
Exactly. The source says peace stems from an inner state supported by a spiritual or moral attitude. Finding solutions means evoking that attitude
How?
through spiritual principles or human values. These aren't just fuzzy ideals. The letter claims they offer practical solutions. Good intentions are nice, knowledge helps, but principles are essential. Why? Because they give a perspective that harmonizes with our true human nature. They create the right attitude, a dynamic, a will, an aspiration.
So leaders need to identify principles first, then act.
That's the advice. Let principles guide the practical steps.
Okay, this focus on principle leads directly into the third main section, right? Which tackles the huge question. How can the world actually shift from conflict to harmony?
And the answer given is absolutely foundational. It says world order can only be built on an unshakable consciousness of the oneness of mankind.
The oneness of mankind.
Yes. A spiritual truth, it calls it, but one that all the human sciences confirm. Anthropology, physiology, psychology, they all see one human species, just with infinite variety.
And accepting that truth means?
Abandonment of prejudice of every kind. That's the starting point.
And this isn't just a feeling, it's the first fundamental prerequisite for organizing the world as one country.
Exactly. It has to be universally proclaimed, taught in schools, and constantly asserted. That's how you prepare people for the big organic change in the structure of society that follows from recognizing oneness.
The letter then quotes Shoghi Effendi, who interpreted Baha'u'llah's writings, on what this reconstruction looks like.
Yes, and Shoghi Effendi's description is sweeping. He calls it no less than the reconstruction and the demilitarization of the whole civilized world. A world organically unified in essentials, politics, spirit, trade, finance, even script and language, but crucially, infinite in the diversity of the national characteristics of its federated units.
So unification doesn't mean erasing differences.
No, he's very clear. It's not about subverting foundations, but broadening them, remolding institutions. It doesn't kill legitimate loyalties or patriotism. It doesn't abolish national autonomy.
But it does demand something.
It does. It does not ignore the diversity of origins, climate, history, language, tradition, but it does call for a wider loyalty, a larger aspiration. It insists upon the subordination of national impulses and interests to the imperative claims of a unified world.
And that leads to the famous Bahá'í principle.
Unity in diversity, that's the watchword, repudiating excessive centralization and rejecting uniformity. A very specific balance.
Achieving that balance requires changing national political attitudes, which the letter calls anarchy because there are no universal laws between nations.
Right. It acknowledges the League and UN tried, but says they were ultimately incapable of preventing war. And it points out that Baha'u'lláh proposed solutions way back in the 19th century, including collective security.
Shoghi Effendi's interpretation then sketches out the structure of this future world order.
He says Baha'u'llah's words point towards an inevitable curtailment of unfettered national sovereignty. That's a necessary step for a future commonwealth of all the nations.
Right.
And this requires, he argues, some form of a world superstate.
A world superstate. What would it do, according to this vision?
Well, nations would willingly give up the right to make war, certain tax rights, and the right to have armies beyond internal policing. This superstate would need a powerful international executive, a world parliament elected by the people, and a supreme tribunal whose decisions are binding.
That's a pretty detailed picture. Shoghi Effendi gave a broader outline too, didn't he?
Yes, the source quotes his vision of this order, a world with no economic barriers, capital and labor interdependent, religious fanaticism gone, racial hatred extinguished, a single international law backed by collective force, and nationalism transformed into world citizenship. That, he says, is the order anticipated by Baha'u'llah.
So how does this actually happen? How do we get there? The letter quotes Baha'u'llah about a specific event.
Yes. The time must come when the imperative necessity for the holding of a vast and all-embracing assemblage of men will be universally realized. Rulers and leaders must attend, consult, and lay the foundations for peace.
And the key to making that happen?
It connects back to understanding the reality of man, namely his thought, and the method. Candid, dispassionate, and cordial consultation, followed by action. Consultation is presented as absolutely vital.
What does Baha'u'lláh say about consultation itself?
The quote is beautiful. Consultation bestows greater awareness and transmutes conjecture into certitude. It is a shining light. The maturity of the gift of understanding is made manifest through consultation. The letter even suggests that just the attempt to have this global consultation could release such a salutary spirit that no power could resist the final triumphal outcome.
And Abdu'l-Bahá, his son, added more detail about this world gathering.
He did. The source includes his guidance. They must make peace the object of general consultation, establish a union of the nations, create a binding treaty and establish a covenant, proclaim it everywhere, and get the sanction of all the human race.
So universal agreement.
Yes. This supreme and a noble undertaking, he says, is the real source of the peace. All humanity has to ensure it lasts. The treaty needs to fix borders, relations, obligations, and strictly limit weapons.
And there's a powerful point about enforcement if someone breaks the treaty.
Very powerful. Abdu'l-Bahá is quoted saying, if any government violates it, all the governments on earth should arise to reduce it to utter submission. Nay, the human race as a whole should resolve to destroy that government. He calls it the greatest of all remedies for a sick world.
Wow. So the letter ends this part saying this great meeting, this mighty convocation is long overdue.
Yes, and it appeals directly to leaders. Seize this opportune moment. Take irreversible steps. It asks if the UN could rise to this challenge and calls on everyone, men, women, youth, children, to support this action. The closing line is a call to our time. Let it be this generation that inaugurates this glorious stage.
Linking back to that idea of stages of evolution.
Exactly.
Okay, so the final section, section 4, it talks about the source of the optimism in the letter and the ultimate goal.
Right. The letter says their optimism comes from seeing beyond just ending war, setting up agencies. Permanent peace is crucial, an essential stage, but it's not the ultimate goal.
So what is the ultimate goal then?
It's stated very clearly the unification of all the peoples of the world in one universal family. That's the destination. Disunity is seen as a danger we just can no longer endure. It quotes Baha'u'llah again, the well-being of mankind, unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. Unity is paramount.
And Shoghi Effendi is quoted again here, emphasizing this drive towards unity, almost like a force of nature.
Yes, he uses really strong imagery. Mankind is groaning, is dying to be led to unity. He says unification of the whole of mankind is the hallmark of the stage which human society is now approaching. We've unified families, tribes, cities, nations. Now it's time for world unity.
He argues nation building is done, state sovereignty as an absolute concept is ending.
Right. The world is maturing. It must abandon this fetish of absolute sovereignty, recognize its oneness and wholeness, and build the machinery needed for unity.
And the letter sees proof of this drive happening already in those hopeful signs mentioned earlier.
Exactly. International movements, UN staff acting like a planetary civil service, global conferences, youth projects, religious groups trying to find common ground.
Ecumenism.
It describes this urge towards unity like a spiritual springtime.
Yeah, constantly battling against war and selfishness, but still a dominant, pervasive feature of life, even back in the late 20th century.
Then the letter offers the Baha'i community itself as a kind of living example of this unity. It does. It describes it as millions of people from all sorts of backgrounds, nations, cultures, classes, creeds, forming a single social organism that reflects human diversity. They run their affairs through consultation, and they honor all divine guidance throughout history.
So it's presented as proof it can work.
As another convincing proof of the practicality of its founder's vision, yes. Evidence that humanity can live as one global society, it's offered as a model for study.
Interesting. And the letter wraps up by reflecting on the whole cask, expressing this deep conviction.
Yes, it expresses reverence for the Creator, who made everyone from the same stock, gave humans this gem-like reality, intellect, nobility, immortality, and the unique ability to know him and to love him. That capacity is seen as the generating impulse and the primary purpose underlying the whole of creation.
The core beliefs about humans that drive this hope.
The letter states their firm conviction. Humans were made to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. Acting like beasts is unworthy. The virtues we should show are trustworthiness, forbearance, mercy, compassion, and loving kindness towards all peoples. And they believe the inherent human potential must all be manifested in this promised day of God. These beliefs, they say, are why they have this unshakable faith that unity and peace are the attainable goal.
It also mentions that Baha'is were facing persecution at the time, but still held on to this hope.
Yes, severe persecution, especially in Iran. But their response, their steadfast hope, is presented as part of the message. They believe the stream of peace is now backed by divine authority through Baha'u'llah's revelation. They offer not just words, but deeds of faith and sacrifice, and join their plea for peace with all victims and everyone who longs for it.
And that final sentence, a direct promise from Baha'u'llah.
Yes, it ends with his words. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come.
Wow. That really was quite a journey through that text. We've covered how this 1985 letter sees world peace not just as, a nice idea, but inevitable, the next stage, though with a huge choice in how we get there.
Right. Through consultation or through suffering, we saw how it diagnosed the world's ills, not blaming human nature itself, but its distortion by materialism and corrupted religion, while also seeing that inherent drive towards unity already at work.
And it didn't just diagnose. It prescribed, saying superficial fixes aren't enough. We need fundamental change based on spiritual principles, oneness, no prejudice, consultation.
Exactly. Leading to that vision of a unified world order, a form of world government, yes, but based on collective security, consultation, and that crucial principle, unity and diversity, all pointing towards that ultimate goal. One universal human family.
It really pushes back against just accepting conflict as normal, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It insists that peace, real unity, is not only possible, but aligns with who we truly are. It makes you think about the difference between just wanting peace and actively building it based on principle.
Absolutely. So thinking about everything this letter puts forward, the inevitability, the choice, the diagnosis, the principles, the vision of world order, that ultimate goal of unification. What part of that promise or maybe challenge stands out most for you today?
That is definitely a great question to leave things on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the promise of world peace.